So it's with really great thanks and pleasure that today we've got Professor Chris Dickinson from the University of Manchester, and her specialist area is really kind of looking at low vision, rehabilitation, supporting people affected by macular conditions in their daily life. And this particular project that has been supported by the Macular Society and has been looking at the need for targeted or personalised rehabilitation and adaptive support. And she had a number of questions that kind of put around what the information was and how that might be delivered, particularly in a time when there's limited time and resources within the eye clinic. But thank you, Chris, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to the Macular Society for supporting this project, and for quite a number of members of the Macular Society for getting involved and being participants in the research as well. I hope you find it interesting, and I'll be very interested in questions that will come up after this. So I'll just say a little bit about, now I have got quite a lot of written information on all the slides that I'm using, but I will say everything that's on the slides. So they're just there as a bit of a reminder to me as well. So as you well know, supporting people with visual impairment involves a lot of different aspects of care. So there are psychological, emotional needs. There are very practical things about aids and training and assessing people's abilities to function in everyday life. And then modifications to the home environment, school and work environment. And that requires a lot of different multidisciplinary involvement. And in the UK, that's delivered in a multi-agency system, which has its strengths, and also it can have its problems because there are so many different people involved. It can all look a bit confusing, particularly to somebody who's starting out on their visual impairment journey. And so what I was really interested in was how we ensure that we get the right advice at the right time and delivered in the right way to individuals, just in order to ease them through this whole passage through their visual impairment journey. And if we have a look at what the scale of the problem is in terms of trying to provide all this information, about 2 million people in the UK have got a significant visual impairment. And if we think about some of the ways in which they are supported, we can see that there's quite a discrepancy between the amount of information that's available and the number of people who might be able to take advantage of that. So a couple of the ways in which people get phenomenal help, eye clinic liaison officers, based usually in hospital departments, but almost half of the UK ophthalmology departments don't have an accredited ECLO, eye clinic liaison officer. There are actually less than 100 in the UK, and the typical ECLO sees about just over 1,000 clients per year, which is not a lot when we think about that 2 million. And of course they are in hospitals, and there may be quite a lot of people who never go to the hospital or only go there irregular intervals. And then an organisation such as the Macular Society, incredibly beneficial to, well, according to the 2019 figures, 370,000 website visitors, 28,000 members. But that's still a relatively small proportion of this overall visual impairment, even though quite a high proportion of those people will have some sort of macular problem. And 300 people per day being diagnosed with macular disease, there's a lot of those people who perhaps are not benefiting from as much information as they could be. So with this background, I got interested in the idea of using some sort of online automatic information system. And I first came into contact with this with a system that IBM had marketed, and which is used today, called IBM Watson, with Deakin University in Australia. And they were using this system with their students. And what they did was they gathered together all the questions that students had asked over the years and all the answers to them. They just asked all the members of staff, what do students ask you and what is it that respond? They created this big database of information, and then the IBM Watson, this artificial intelligence system, was made available to students where they could type in any questions that they had and they'd receive a response. And it was able to match their questions to the responses based on this big database of information that had been gathered from previous staff experiences. And I thought, wouldn't that be a way that perhaps would be useful for people who were visually impaired? So that was the concept of this. It's a chatbot. It's a digital computer-based personal assistant. The idea that it mimics a participant in a human conversation. You can talk to it, it understands the questions that have been asked, and it finds the answer to those questions and then responds verbally. So rather than the Deakin University system, which was all typed, this would be a stage on from that, where everything was spoken information. And the idea would be that it would be able to offer timely advice because it would be available 24/7. It would be hopefully relevant and personalised information, because it wouldn't just be a case of handing out an information pack to individuals when they were diagnosed with a visual problem. It would be a case of saying, what do you want to know? Here's your information source. It will be designed for individuals with a visual impairment, but also carers and family members who might be confused about this situation, and for professionals as well. I've been in low vision rehabilitation for 40 years, but there are still lots of things that I find out on a day-to-day basis that I didn't know before. And it's really difficult to keep up to date with absolutely everything that's going on. Hopefully, with a system like this, it would be continuously updated. And so that led to the AI-VI study. Artificial intelligence in vision impairment is the reason for the initials. Very kindly funded by the Macular Society, a one-year project for a proof of concept. Was this a reasonable idea? Was it worth pursuing any further than that? So a team, the research team, 3 optometrists, including myself, Jake Taylor from Manchester, and Ahalya Subramanian from City University of London. And then the experts in the natural language processing, the people who can take that spoken information and find the answers to those questions in their database, Andre Freitas and Deborah Mendes Ferreira from the computer science department here in Manchester. And we also got a great deal of help from a very helpful expert advisory group, a group of people who have both professional and personal experience of visual impairment, who were able to guide us and make suggestions as to how we could best pursue this project and get the most useful information from it. And so the questions that we wanted to ask in the study: what type of information and support would individuals like and need? Could the device understand what they said to it? And could they find out and respond to the requirements in a useful way? And then how would the individuals themselves respond to the technology? Would it be acceptable to them to be talking to this device and receiving the information from that? How would they trust that information, perhaps, is one of the things that we need to investigate. So we had a 2-phase plan within our study, kind of running alongside each other. In the first phase, in phase 1, we had an online questionnaire, and then we had some in-depth interviews to actually establish what are the requirements of the device if we did set it up. And this was very, very kindly, members of the Macular Society responded to our questionnaire and gave us a great deal of information about this topic. What is it that they wanted? Where did they find their information from normally? And what would be most useful for them? And then we had these 10 interviews where people that we specifically chose who had a very varied experience, who could pursue some of those issues in a little bit more detail. And then alongside that, we then had to design and build a prototype device and test it out and see how it performed. And again, members of the Macular Society were some of our participants in that more detailed investigation. So the phase 1, just to give an idea about what the results of that were. So when we were asking what's the most important information that people with a visual impairment need, then we came up with these 7 sort of groups of information. So information about the eye condition itself, information about assistive equipment, technology, different sorts of adaptation, information about how to carry out daily living activities, and just how to cope on a day-to-day basis. Information about certification and registration as visually impaired, financial and employment advice, emotional support, and then support for carers and family members and giving them information, partly about the eye condition, but also about how they should manage the situation. Parents, what was the prognosis for their children? For family members, how should they treat the visually impaired person? What should they be doing for them? How much should they be letting them do for themselves? And information of that type. And then there was always a possibility that in actual fact, everybody had a good source of information, that there was something out there, the one go-to place that everybody went to get information from. And we really didn't need to think about anything else to supplement that. But in actual fact, we found that people got information from all sorts of places. So some of it online, some of it in person, different sorts of sight loss organisations, societies and charities, social services, council sensory teams, different support groups, peer support, the NHS and the hospitals and optometric practices, GPs, libraries, printed information. The list was almost endless of the wide range of different sources, which is in one way a good thing. There's lots of places you can go to, but it can create a lot of confusion, especially if some of those sources don't seem to be saying the same thing. And then perhaps the critical question for us, would this information be helpful? Would being able to access information from a digital assistant be helpful to our participants? What do they think? So a mixture of responses, as you might expect. Some people saying, yes, there would be some things that would be very useful. Some people saying, no, I don't think so. So our yes and positive responses would be that you could access it 24/7 and you could get a very fast response. So instantaneously, you'd be able to get the answer that wouldn't necessarily be the case if you were having to go to a real person. It was easier that you could just speak and listen to the information because there's no reading to do, no typing, no switching on any device. You could use it independently, not rely on other people to have to set it up, be the hope. It would be a hands-free device, so useful if you're actually doing some sort of task at the same time as getting the information. Hopefully it could be one source of contact. You wouldn't have to go to lots of different places. It would automatically give you all the information in one place. There was a privacy element to it, in a good sense here, that people thought they might be willing to ask a computer questions that they wouldn't perhaps be willing to ask a real person, something that they might be a bit too embarrassed to ask, or perhaps it was a question they'd asked lots of times before and they would be worried that somebody would be a little impatient having to answer this question again. And then you could choose the timing of the information and the amount of information that you got. And people felt that sometimes they weren't quite ready to have the information. They needed a little bit of a delay whilst they got used to the situation before they were ready to handle the information, or they were certainly able to handle large amounts of information. So they were very keen to choose their own time and choose their amount of information that they got. So all of that sounded quite positive. Of course, there are some negative aspects that we were very aware of as well. People were worried that it might not be accurate information and that you really wouldn't be quite sure of where it was coming from. In the same way that when you type something into a search engine on the internet, you don't really know whether that information is trustworthy or not. Worried that the information might be too generic, it wouldn't really be personalised enough to them. It would have to be very general information, especially when you're talking about somebody's health and their different eye conditions, where everybody has their own unique set of circumstances. Obvious issues with people who have hearing problems or speech difficulties, that the machine might not understand them when they were speaking to it. A feeling that this computer might be a little impersonal, a little bit uncaring, and wouldn't really be anything like talking to a real person. And then maybe just simply not necessary. There are plenty of sources of information out there. We really don't need another one. So that gives us a good balance as to how we needed to structure the next stage of the project. And so in phase 2, we had to test out a prototype, well, build a prototype and then test it. And so we had to have this database of questions and answers. So we had a good idea from that phase 1 about what the topics were that people were interested in. And so we had a whole list of questions and answers that we developed based on that. Now that was all written, that's all in written format. So literally a spreadsheet with a whole range of questions and a whole range of answers. And we had to then do the speech bit. So we had to take speech recognition coming into the system, transferring that speech into a written piece of text, and then finding the question in the database, locating the answer, and then outputting the answer as a spoken piece of information. We had 2 extra bits to tag on to the end of our just database of information. So then we tested that system. We had 7 participants taking part in this, and we asked each of them to ask 5 questions. And we picked deliberately areas that we, again, had identified as being areas that were of concern to people. So the first question they could ask was something around access to benefits registration as a person who's visually impaired. Then something around details about the eye condition. And then something about treatments or research about their condition. Then a question about practical help, magnifiers, gadgets, assistive devices. And then a question about information or signposting or where to find additional help. Now, of course, everybody asked these questions in different ways. So one of the things we'd had to do when we were setting up the database was to train our artificial intelligence to be able to understand different ways of asking the question. So even if everybody was asking, what's macular degeneration? Everybody would ask it in slightly different ways and would use slightly different terminology. The machine had to be able to understand which of those questions were the same, which were asking a different sort of question. So these are just some examples of the questions that were asked based on those categories. So somebody said, what benefits am I entitled to for macular degeneration? Is there any treatment for dry AMD? So the machine has to understand that dry AMD is macular degeneration. Where can I get assistive devices like binoculars? Where can I find more information on guide dogs? Is there somewhere that I can find a quicker appointment? So those are the types of questions that people asked, and some of them we were kind of expecting, some of them were a little bit more difficult, and the machine had a few more problems with them as well. So if we have a look at the results, now out of the 35 questions, 5 from each of 7 people, there were only actually 18 of those that had answers in our database. And that was kind of what we would have expected. We couldn't have dealt with every question at this early prototype stage. There were some things we were expecting more than others. And so 6 out of the 7 questions about benefits, we were able to answer the question. The answers were there in the database, but only 2 out of the 7 about eye conditions were there. And that was mostly because although a lot of the participants had macular disease in one way or another, they also had other conditions as well. And they tended to ask about those other conditions rather than about the macular disease. But of the questions that were on the database, the machine was able to locate the correct answers 100% of the time, which was very helpful for us. And we also asked people's opinion about the machine. These are just a sample of some of the questions. So we asked people whether we gave people some statements and asked them whether they agreed or disagreed, strongly agreed, strongly disagreed, or they were neutral about this particular statement. So one was, the system is able to understand what I say most of the time. And most people agreed that was correct. I understand what the system is saying to me. Again, that was an agreement. They also agreed, I believe this system can provide accurate information and the system would have a positive influence in my daily life. And when we got strongly agreed to, I think this system can improve my access to information and using the system is easy and understandable. So again, that was very positive for us that there were those useful aspects. It did look like we had a device that did have some promise going forward. People were less confident, although perhaps more so than a wider range of the population, but just asking them what they thought about the artificial intelligence and whether there are any issues about this sort of computerized system, perhaps a little bit separately to the fact that it's about visual impairment or not. And so people neither agreed or disagreed with these statements. So I'm concerned because it's not clear who's responsible if the system provides wrong information. And that is certainly something which has become a general concern in AI systems. Who's responsible, the professionals or the device? And then I'm concerned that this system may reduce conversations between professionals and patients. Again, people neither agreed or disagreed with that one. And I'm concerned that this system might use my information for other purposes without my knowledge and authorization. Again, a very common concern within artificial intelligence and recording information more broadly. But obviously this system comes into that same sort of category. Does the device find out a lot of information about people that then might be used for different purposes than they expect? So of course, those are things that we will certainly take into account going forward. And so our future work, what we would like to move on and do is to develop a much larger database of questions and answers and try and find a good way of having sustainable and updatable information. To be able to cope with different speeds of speech, and we hadn't really thought about this as being an issue, but some people talk quite slowly, and the device has to know when people are just talking slowly and having a natural pause, or whether they've finished the question and it can start to look for the answer. And then developing empathy, people said that they would like it to have a more natural voice rather than a robotic type of voice. And also we found from our phase 1 questionnaires that people find peer support very, very important to them and a fantastic source of information and just general useful contact. And so we would like to find out a bit more about what we could do with an automatic device to maybe make it behave a little bit more like peer support. And we're also very conscious about exploring the requirements of individuals from ethnic minorities. We didn't have a great deal of our participants from different ethnic minorities, and we're conscious that differences in culture might make this device more or less appealing to that group of people, and they may have completely different requirements of it. And it also gives us an opportunity to think about whether we could have this information being provided in a whole range of different languages. And I think that would be a very valuable resource because a lot of information that's available about different diseases and more generally is available in English, but not necessarily in a whole range of different languages. So if this device was able to speak to people in their own language, that could be a very helpful thing. And also think there's an opportunity to link with well-being support more generally. So we could link the device to a well-being app and have that type of support included, as well as more practical information in terms of coping with visual impairment. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions and say once more thanks to the Macular Society for inviting me to come along and for supporting this study.
Great, thank you. So, well, again, if people have a little bit of time to reflect and to ask any questions, put those into the chat. In the meantime, I'm happy to kind of kick things off because thanks really very much for a great presentation. And it's really interesting to kind of see how you went around, you know, developing the questions and the survey and the responses people got, because as you said, you know, this kind of thing that is already around out there, and people will have seen or had some experience of a chatbot with customer service in some way, or perhaps and particularly that might be challenging for people with sight loss and actually interacting, engaging with that. The first question was, have you seen any kind of good examples of that, you know, not necessarily in other health areas or in other areas? Did you do some kind of background research into what good kind of looked like before kind of applying that to the kind of visual impairment space?
Yes, I think there are some interesting examples, but often it does rely quite a lot on graphical information. and trying to engage people, and especially with the well-being type of apps, there is a lot about how the visual presentation of it looks, and so that would be something that would be quite different in this particular field. And I think it's also a little bit different that the range of topics is quite a lot broader. So there are some of these things in cancer care, but the journeys are a little bit more similar, I think, in cancer care than perhaps in visual impairment.
Yeah, and I think the other point that just really stood out was the fact that obviously, I guess in an ideal world, we'd like to have as much time as possible with a consultant or with the eye nurse specialist and be able to ask them all the questions we might have on the day or at a later date, but that's not necessarily practical. And so this is what you're interested in kind of that, how that's what all of that information might be, as well as how that might be delivered. And I think some people, as you said, have a very bad experience so far of this kind of chatbot type approach. So how would you think we would kind of get that usage more accepted, or how would we kind of manage the introduction of that?
I mean, I think one of the things we have to say about the study that was a major limitation was that we really had to do the whole thing online, just because it was done through the COVID period. And so we tended to have people who were much more familiar with tech, who were responding to us. First of all, our questionnaire was entirely online. And then when we did our experiment in phase 2, we did the whole experiment online. So we're very conscious that we didn't engage with people who perhaps are a little bit less familiar with tech. Now, it may be that they're completely unfamiliar and so they don't have any of those preconceptions, or it may be that they just think, I'm not going anywhere near that sort of technology. So that would be a major thing to look at, is whether we can engage that audience who don't have access to perhaps that sort of information through other ways. Because quite a lot of the people who responded to us, they'd got several different devices. They had lots of different internet ways of getting information, as well as all the more in-person ways. Yes,
and I think that's a really good point in that how we perhaps broaden that out. So one of the questions we've got is, it's a small and focused study, and how relevant to the wider population do you think that this might be? And have you got any plans for larger studies? How would you bring in that kind of people who are less technologically experienced, but still make it kind of relevant and accessible to them?
I mean, I think, as you say, it's that next stage on from the study, and we had plans for doing that in this study, but just because of COVID, we couldn't do that. So I think we would hope to engage with people who are perhaps harder to reach, perhaps directly through hospital clinics, and through trying to find different ways of contacting people, where they're not people who have contact with the Macular Society, they're not people who have contact with the local blind societies and so on, that they're people who perhaps attend the hospital but then kind of disappear and don't really get involved with as much support, and trying to really target that population to see how they would respond to this type of thing. But yes, there are several different ways in which this project could go forward, and we have these different sort of work packages, grant application ready to go.
As always, yes, oven ready perhaps. On a practical note, so a person has asked, Marilyn, thank you for your question. How would it be accessed? And I asked a similar question. Is it on a website? Is it an app? Could it be by telephone, automated, like telephone booking systems? What's your thoughts around that?
It can be any of those things. And the question is whether we try and make it something which can do all of those things, or whether we do go for one particular way of delivering it. So potentially it could be any or all of those, but I think at some point we would have to make some decision, and I think probably my preference certainly is for it to be completely standalone, that it really you don't have to do anything to it at all in terms of linking it to other devices and other systems, because I think as soon as we do that, we're back to saying that somebody has to have an additional person to help them set the whole thing up. I think if it's going to appeal to people who perhaps wouldn't have access to more traditional ways of doing things, it's going to have to be extremely straightforward to set up. And
yeah, and that kind of leads on.
There are loads of devices that say that they're very straightforward, and they're not. They're really not.
No, and this this leads on to the next question: would you need to provide training to be able to use it? And I think that's an important thing, that a lot of things, particularly within the NHS, are moving towards that more kind of digital access. But obviously, not everybody can move along at that pace, and so you still want things to be usable and accessible, but you also don't want to have a whole load of training necessary to be able to access it. So how did you approach that part?
I think it would have to be something that really, well, again, my personal preference really requires no training at all. I think if it's any training, that's a major difficulty, because this isn't the sort of device you're going to be using every single day. So if you were only using, I mean, even if you're using it once a week, which I think would be very valuable, you'll have forgotten how to use it. If there are subtleties in the way that it's used, I think people will just forget, and then it won't work when they go to it the next time, and so they'll think, oh, I'll just give up with it. So it has to be incredibly simple to be able to do it. Not that people couldn't learn how to do it, but I just think, why would they be bothered? It then becomes,
it's almost like if you have to be trained to do it, then it's almost too much trouble in the first place. A question, I think you kind of covered this in the sense that it was the database is not of multiple conditions. It was very focused on macular degeneration. But do you see this as being possibly broadening out and being used in other health areas?
Yes, I certainly think that that's a possibility, because there are several conditions where you sort of have a chronic health condition where people's needs and requirements are quite varied, and they do change across a period of time. And I think that's probably what makes the visual impairment and what makes this valuable for visual impairment, is that people do require different types of information at different times, and it's really difficult for professionals to judge when they should be passing that information over to people. So is it very practical information that people want at one point in time, or is it psychological support? And it's really difficult to judge exactly when you should be doing that for each individual person, because everybody is different. And each person, at one point they'll require very practical help, and at one point they won't. They'll have sorted all those things out. And I think it does lend itself to that sort of very varying needs that are very difficult for external people to predict, but that the individual themselves knows exactly what they want at that time.
Yeah, I think one of your first slides kind of summed it up with it. It's about the right information at the right time to the right person as well, because it might be the friends and family rather than the person affected themselves at that time. That's kind of the ultimate challenge, really, of anyone providing information, support and education to people, and certainly something that across our services that we're looking at different ways of being able to access, of which this is a really exciting way to kind of help to get our information out to that audience at the time that they need it and are responsive to it.
Yes, I mean, I'm very conscious, because I work in a hospital clinic, and we have this sort of pack of information that you give to people as a standard, and I'm sure people don't look at it. They kind of know that they've got it, but it does get put in the back of a cupboard because they're just too overwhelmed by it at the time that they get it, and half of it isn't quite relevant to them at that time, but probably would be if they could access it.
And that's why, from the Macular Society's point of view, it's key for people to know that we're here for when you need us, whenever you need us, and not that can be much later after a diagnosis or at any time. So a couple of, I mean, you particularly picked up around, you wanted this project to be very much around natural language and speech. Is there an opportunity, though, for people to type out questions? I know that's more difficult from a kind of sight loss point of view, but the person who asked this question was particularly where there is speech impairment or speech difficulty. Could it be kind of extended for typing as well?
Yes, because that, in a way, that's actually what the device does. It takes the natural speech and turns it into a written sentence, and then it takes it into the database. So essentially, you'd just be taking out a stage of the process in that. But essentially, that's what, for example, sight loss FAQs is, you know, there are those systems at the moment with written questions.
Thank you. And a very quick question, would there be a cost to the user for this? I'm guessing you're thinking that it would be free at the point of use.
That's what you'd hope, yes.
Yeah.
Certainly we'd like to produce it like that.
And I guess, yeah, this is a question, I'm just kind of digesting it. Thank you, Thelma, for your great question here. You know, we know that it's interesting that as part of the pathway, you know, it's almost everybody should have access to an ECLO, an eye clinic liaison officer for those. But as you said, not everybody does have that, or it's kind of covered in different ways, not necessarily having an individual as an ECLO. And obviously before COVID, and even during COVID, that, you know, obviously that was much more difficult to get that kind of communication, and that communication leads to lack of trust or how a person is dealt with there. It's that kind of, it's not necessarily an ethical challenge, but how do you kind of get that balance between, again, that the time and resources needed to kind of build up that relationship and to have that kind of personal interaction versus something that perhaps is seen as even less, you know, less human contact because it's a virtual artificial intelligence delivery.
Yeah, I mean there is that issue, but you could argue that something like, let's say, psychological support and emotional support and cognitive behavioural therapy would be something that people wouldn't react to very well from a machine, because, you know, it's all about feelings and emotions. But in actual fact, it can be very, very successful, partly because, you know, it's a bit like saying that it would be easier to talk to somebody you don't know about some very personal emotional things than it is to talk to your family and friends. And it can be the same in the same way for some people. So yes, some people may feel it's inappropriate to talk. They don't feel that connection with the computer, but some people may find it easier to have those conversations because it isn't quite so personal and quite so emotional. There may be some things that they feel reluctant to share with.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and you kind of seen that in some kind of either on Facebook, people sharing information that you would think you wouldn't share naturally with your friends and family directly, but they're quite happy to kind of put it out there, type it out there, asking specific questions as well. So, and it's about really having lots of different ways of accessing that information that kind of appeals to an individual, because I think, as you said, they'll all have different questions at different times. They'll even phrase those questions in different ways, and actually want to kind of consume that information in different ways as well.
And as you sort of hinted, I mean, there is a bit of an ethical issue about if a question is asked which suggests that the person really does need some help beyond the device itself. And of course, you'd have sort of safeguards. There would be triggers where there's the device stops at a certain point and says, do you want to refer to a person? Do you feel that you need some help from an individual rather than from the machine?
Yeah, or to signpost.
There are certain answers that would be given that would suggest really need to move you on, and so the machine says, well, I can't answer that question, but I can refer you to the person who can answer that question.
Yeah. And I think, and again, another question. Thank you, Marilyn. Got other ideas in terms of how you could provide, for example, producing a booklet in this particular large type with the top 100 questions. And I think, you know, what you was that's a great idea. We do have lots of information, that leaflets on the Macular Society. You can call our helpline and order some of that information. But it's like, as you said, that's one channel, and it's almost like the more channels you have to the right information, and this is extending that more. That's even great, because you know, even we could spend quite a lot of money sending out booklets to every single optician. They won't necessarily still get into the hands of the people that needed it at the right time. And so that's part of our challenge kind of moving forward, is kind of providing the information, and perhaps the same information but in different ways, so with audio, with video, with text as well, because people people kind of can go back to consume and learn in different ways that are relevant for them. And some people will definitely respond to this approach, and others won't be so interested in getting their information that way.
And I think that is also an issue about printed information. It's just whether it's up to date.
Yeah.
So some things don't change very much, but there may be some points in time at which something changes fundamentally, and that information becomes really out of date, and then you feel the responsibility. You've got to replace it. If you've got electronic information, you've got a much better chance of keeping it updated and making sure that everybody gets updated at the same time, and not that there's one really well-informed group of professionals, but quite a lot of people are still behind.
And that's the next question, was exactly around that. Does the information give details and even sources to kind of indicate where that information has come from or how up to date it is?
Yeah, so I think that will be part of it, where I mean, my idea really was to have something that was a sort of a joint resource that was perhaps supported by several different charities, organisations, where everybody's responsible for updating one part of it, which I think is the same sort of thing with the site FAQs that exist at the moment. That's a group of 6 organisations that came together to produce those, and kind of each organisation regularly updates the questions that it's responsible for. And I think that will be the type of thing that you'd hope for, is that it was a joint resource and everybody kind of shared the responsibility for keeping their sections of it updated. Yeah,
that's right. And did you also, I think, obviously kind of surveyed more the users? Did you survey in the same way, or what was the kind of response from the health professionals around this kind of approach as well?
Yes, I think they were positive about it, and again, they told us the sort of information and the sort of resources that they felt would be helpful. So yes, I think again the idea that you've mentioned of as many different ways as possible of trying to get out to the population that need this information.
Were there any that kind of said, "Oh, this will put me out of a job," or it means I've got more time to do other things? We wouldn't necessarily want it to replace the kind of face-to-face aspect as well, because that is important, and people given the opportunity to. And we're certainly, if you call the helpline, I encourage you to kind of take a list of questions once you are in front of the consultant, and make sure that you are getting those questions answered. Again, there are lots of feedback. Thank you for those, about people who are interested in the concept. And is there an opportunity to get involved in the future? And if so, how might they do that?
So I think probably if we do manage to get funding to take it forward, then we would probably regularly be looking for volunteers, and we'd certainly be very grateful for the Macular Society's support in publicising it. So if we were looking for volunteers, we'd approach the Macular Society for publicity.
Yeah, so kind of keep in touch, and we'll take it from there. And actually, that's a really good opportunity in that for the audience, you'll be aware that we're supporting a number of different research projects, and actually we've been growing a kind of people who are interested in research database. And so again, we can follow up and send you information around that. Look at that on our website. In fact, it's probably a good opportunity, if you're not already signed up to our e-news, that's a good opportunity for that, because we put a lot of these sorts of opportunities, and also what the next topics of the Macular and Me webinars are in that. And it's certainly, I think we've got over 3,000 people who are interested in elements of research, and when those opportunities come up, we either kind of, if people are looking for specific macular disease areas or different experiences, we'll kind of use that as an opportunity. Or if it's more broad, like you want to get involved with this kind of patient-led or research, then we have those opportunities coming up on a number of times. So yes, I guess how soon do you kind of turning it from the kind of prototype into something that's available? Obviously, you mentioned a number of times you've got some ideas. It is kind of dependent on project, but if you got that kind of next phases of projects supported, what would your kind of timeline be for that?
I suppose it would be a couple of years. before it was sort of being able to be used in a reasonably comprehensive sort of way. I mean, I think that one of the things we would do in terms of our prototype study this time, it was very much a case of trying it for an hour, you know, just asking a very small selection of questions.
Yeah.
I think what we would want to do next is to do a prototype study where somebody had the device over a period of time, and we looked at, you know, whether they interacted with it just once and then that was kind of it, or whether it was something that they asked questions regularly. So we would be looking perhaps to get people involved over a period of, you know, maybe several months, where we sort of monitored that continuous use, or whether it was something that really just wasn't useful over a continuing basis, but really was a one-off sort of thing. So that would be certainly a good opportunity for people to volunteer if they were interested for that sort of more extended use prototype study.
And another kind of practical question was that, so, you know, the AI part of it, obviously that is the brains of what's behind this. And is that at an affordable cost to people in that, to the likes of us, the charity sector, or is that part of kind of IBM's and others kind of corporate responsibility, then kind of making that open to a wider group of people, or is there a limit?
Yes, our AI is available. Yes, so that is useful. Yes, so we didn't go down the IBM Watson route. Right, okay. So we did do our own AI.
Right, that's great. Okay, and I think just the opportunity to ask any final questions there. That's been really interesting, and thank you very much, Christine. I know that you're also, you know, this was one area of your projects that and more broadly, you're interested in, and you do other, you know, access to healthcare, particularly around rehabilitation and adherence to medicine or appointments. You know, what other areas are you currently working on that's relevant to kind of macular disease and in other projects?
Well, as you say, yes, the access to healthcare, and conscious of the fact that there was the accessible information regulations changed back in 2016, but it didn't seem that really it made a great deal of difference to how people were able to access healthcare. There wasn't a huge change in either providers or individuals themselves being aware of that change. And so have done some studies and sort of interviewed people and asked them about their experiences with going to appointments and things like getting appointment letters in large print or not. And people, you know, turning up an appointment desk and somebody says, oh, go and sit over there, or go and sit on the red chair, and things like that, and not really taking account of the fact. And I'd always thought of that as being something that was because of visual impairment being fairly invisible. But talking to people in interviews, they were saying that even when they sort of got a guide dog and a long cane, people were still giving them those sorts of instructions and expecting them to be able to see to get around. And things like signing consent forms, which again seems to be very confusing about the people who ask individuals to sign consent forms, seem very reluctant for them to use magnifiers and other different sorts of assistive strategies. So.
Yeah, it does seem, it was a couple of weeks ago now, but it does seem quite surprising that although the accessible information requirements have been there for a long time, they're not necessarily being implemented in, you know, consistently across the NHS when, you know, it's kind of legislated to do that. And so there've been a number of different kind of both news and also kind of studies around that as well. And it's certainly something that, you know, we're getting involved in broadly across the VI sector, vision impairment sector, in order to kind of raise the profile of that, you know, for macular and for other conditions as well, and just, you know, even just accessing other health conditions as well.
And then on a completely different sort of line, I'm quite interested in looking at different sorts of devices and how they can help. So I have been involved with things like telescopes for mobility and devices of that sort. And mobility courses, setting out a mobility course to sort of see how people cope with that is incredibly difficult to do. and dangerous for people as well. You don't really want to be asking people to navigate through obstacles.
Right, yeah.
We've been looking at doing using VR and virtual reality.
Okay, yeah.
We have virtual obstacle courses. So
Yeah.
we have an obstacle course which is a cluttered attic room with lots of things lying around the floor that people have to walk over, and we've been seeing whether we can use that type of thing to test people's mobility, rather than subjecting them to really complicated and potentially dangerous.
And well, that's certainly something that we're using, and with, you may be aware of, we have the Eyes Habit Partnership, where we've been raising the profile of some of the challenges politically and with the NHS system around, and so in conjunction with Roche, they've developed a VR tool to kind of show what it is like to be to have a macular disease condition. So, and they do simple tasks, but with the kind of typical kind of sight loss and visual impairment around that as well, and that's proving very kind of an important way of getting that message across.
Yeah.
So just thank you. People have been kind of putting a few comments in. A very interesting talk, promising for the future, and thank you for that. I guess that kind of leads on to just a kind of final question, and you may think it's a little bit out of context, but just for all the audience as well, we're going to be asking this question at the end of every Macular and Me session for the next few weeks, just because to kind of get interest from the different researchers. But what are your hopes for the future for people affected by macular disease?
Well, I'm an optometrist, so that's my sort of training. So I'm very interested in low vision aids and provision of different sorts of optical devices. And I was very disappointed 20 years ago, whatever, that there wasn't an integrated scheme across England in the same way that there is across Wales, and I think very shortly across Scotland, that they're going to follow, and that there wasn't a way in which low vision services couldn't be put out into the community rather than being concentrated in hospitals. So I think that system in England that the Welsh and the Scottish have got would be a major improvement in I think it was a big mistake. And also I was very annoyed because we had evidence base that the Welsh system of providing electronic aid was beneficial. So people have always argued, well, you've got to have hard evidence before you can suggest that aid should be provided. Well, we had a randomized control trial, we had all the evidence, we had health economics data and everything that showed that it was beneficial to provide electronic aids, but we still couldn't get the English to go along with that.
No, that's a great and something that is very close to the Macular Society's heart as well. And that's really kind of one of our key asks. And people may be aware again that there's we don't actually know who it is yet, but we know that there is a national clinical director that's been appointed by the NHS for the first time for eyes, and we've kind of got a bit of a shopping list for them as to what they should be prioritising. And one of those is that kind of better integration between the primary care, the opticians and the high street, and the secondary care, both kind of pre and diagnosis, as well as then post treatment or rehabilitation back into the community as well. So we'll be talking again, I'm sure, Chris, around that. Great, so thank you very much for that, and again thank you very much for everybody who participated today. Again, comments, keep sending your comments through. Thank you very much for another useful session. Lots of people are interested in either the research that you've been talking about or other research as well, and my colleague Emma has been posting the how to get involved and take part in our research link there as well. And again, just so our next webinar will be in a month's time, and we are not 100% sure at this moment in time who the speaker will be, or it might be around kind of macular holes. It's a bit kind of fluid at the moment, and as you can expect, once we've finished one, we concentrate then on the next one as well. But as I mentioned, focusing on getting signed up to the e-news, to kind of which comes out on a regular basis. We'll have you telling you the relevant information and how you can register for the next webinar in a month's time. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Hope everyone can enjoy their evening, and thank you really for your time today, and great, well done with the research. And we look forward to discussing further and seeing some of the reports that you've been writing up. And I think, as you mentioned, you're actually going to be presenting this to the wider research community as well, which is really important, sharing that information.
Well, thank you very much indeed to everybody, and a thank you once again to all the people who actually took part in the research. And I certainly encourage people to sign up to be a participant potentially with the different sorts of research studies, because quite a lot of those do take place online, so you don't have to necessarily be in the right geographical area for some of those projects.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.